Welcome back to Grumpy Vet Garage. I'm the Grumpy Vet Dino. In a previous video, I showed you prepping to install new heads, head gaskets, and head studs on a 2007 Chevy Silverado 2500 HD with an LBZ Duramax. That video was uploaded fine. I then started videotaping for the install of all those items on my truck. And in that process, my computer decided to die and take all those videos with it. I still have some of the footage, none of the really key parts. I'm still going to show you the fuel injector installs, but all the key things that I wanted to show you were lost. So instead of this being a how-to and showing you how I installed all those things on my truck, I figured I would go ahead and talk about the takeaways from doing that install with you. So the weather's not really cooperating with me right now, so let's move inside and talk about the head gasket install. Okay, we moved inside the garage. The wind was just not going to let me do this video outside, so I wanted to have the Silverado behind me while doing this video. It just was not going to happen. Silverado's outside getting all that wind. But first thing I want to talk about is head prep. So I removed my heads, and I very well could have had those heads tested, resurfaced, and then reinstalled those heads. But I didn't have any machine shop in the local area that I knew of, maybe there is one, that I felt confident sending my heads to get that done. There was one machine shop said they could machine them, but that they're testing. When I asked them about testing the heads, they're like, "What do you mean?" So I was like, "Okay, I just don't need you to go deck it and hand it back to me. I wanted you to make sure that I didn't have a problem. Testing the head, make sure that I don't have a crack somewhere, that type of thing." So I didn't really trust that process. Not saying that they're a bad machine shop, but diesel heads is something they had seen that often, I'm assuming. So I decided to go with a fleece performance head. It's already been tested, it's machined, it's a good to go head right out the box, and the packaging that I showed you in the previous video, they came in great shape. So that's the route I went. What you don't want to do is think that you're just going to pull your head, clean them up, and then put them down. There's a lot of work involved with getting to the point where you're going to be able to reinstall items back onto this engine to have it work. All that work, you don't want to waste it with a job that isn't going to hold up long term. You don't want to hand sand an aluminum head for these engines. You really don't want to do that. Coming from the DSM community here with my 2G Eclipse, many people turn around, pull heads, use composite head gaskets, and fire ring the engine block and seal that way. But that's not the setup we're doing. We're not doing a drag racing setup with our truck. We're trying to get something that can handle the abuse of being a diesel engine long term. My truck went 350,000 miles before needing this. I'm hoping that after this, it's going to go another 350,000 miles. So don't cut corners here and think, I'm just going to clean this head up and throw it back on. Make sure to either get them resurfaced and checked, or just purchase new heads that have already been gone through. Also, part of head prep is actually moving components over from your old head to your new head, whether it's a resurfaced head or a new fleece head. You're going to need to move over exhaust manifolds, and you're going to need to move over the intake plenum. You're going to want to use a new gasket for your exhaust manifolds, but this also could be an opportunity to upgrade those manifolds. I didn't do that. Again, I'm not trying to push ridiculous amount of power, but once you pull these heads, you'll realize on the driver's side, that head, not that head, but the exhaust manifold, there's actually a section that's actually smashed in. I'll try to feed in a picture here to kind of show you what I'm talking about. There are upgraded manifolds that you can get from numerous places. BD Diesel is one that comes off the top of my head, that you can get a full flow or full bore manifold to put on. This would be a perfect time to do that, seeing as how you're already in that area, everything's already removed out of the way, to put that in. I just didn't think it was needed for me in my application, but I'm not you. You do what you need to do. But you need to go ahead and put a new multi-layer steel gasket in that area, and then torque on the exhaust manifold. If you're doing this all by yourself, wait to do this. Don't torque on the exhaust manifold. The head with the plenum, and you're going to use the fuel rail as like a handle to kind of put it back in. It is already not heavy. I like to think I'm a pretty strong guy. Not heavy, but awkward. So you're going to, and I'm going to get into block prep and and laying on the multi-layer steel head gasket, but you don't want to overburden yourself trying to get around some obstacles and get them back in there. Again, we're doing this in our driveway. We're doing this with the cab on. Leaving off the exhaust manifold is going to be worthwhile to you. That's how I did it. But if you decide, hey, I got a buddy, somebody to help you, then this would be a good time to go ahead and put on your exhaust manifold. Put on that exhaust manifold, you're going to need to torque it on. And the torque spec for those bolts and studs, depending on what kind of setup, I replaced the hardware with ARP hardware from a kit that was made by Merchant Automotive. But either way, the torque's going to be the same. That torque is going to be 28 foot-pounds. Additionally, you're going to need to move over the intake plenums. Taking them off your old head, you're going to notice, especially if you ran EGR for a long period of time, they are going to be gross. You're going to need to clean those. Once you get them all cleaned up and they're ready to go onto the new head, with the Y-Bridge gasket kit that I bought from Molly, it came with their own RTV. This is JV8. This was good stuff, really easy to use right out of the tube. But you're going to need to seal on your new intake plenums onto the head using RTV. There isn't a gasket that I know of. And you can see there's a groove that's actually machined into that to help you use RTV and make it seal well. But you're going to need to torque that on. And the torque spec on that one ended up being 18 foot-pounds. So torquing on your exhaust manifold, torquing on your intake plenum, everything else as far as studs and other mounts, you can move them directly from the old head to the new head. Taking pictures is really good here to kind of, so you know exactly the configuration of the studs on the front of the cylinder head. I took those pictures. I moved them also over to my computer and they're gone too. But take those pictures so that you can actually reference them while putting it back together. But that would be head prep. Next thing moving forward, something that I think that was the most intimidating thing to me, block prep. There's a lot of information on the internet about how to do this, especially some GM specific information. General Motors says that you need to use a grit no coarser than 600 grit using flat bar stock to then sand the surface of the block. 600 grit sandpaper, not exactly easy to find at your local auto parts store. It seems like it's a jump from 400 to 800. You'll find that. Bar stock can be rather expensive to get. And then on top of that, ensuring that it's flat is somewhat problematic as well. I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm not saying it's not a good idea. I think the bar stock to sand with is very important. I was going to get long boards to do the sanding with, and the sanding, before I get too far, the sanding is moving from the front of the engine to the back of the engine. So you never want to sand like intake to exhaust, not across it, but actually front to back. You're going to try to sand. So I just want to make sure that's clear. You're never going to want to go up and down. It's a long motion. So your standard sandpaper that you get at the auto parts store is the 8x11. To get something to fit on there, you would need to get a board that would hold an 11-inch long sheet. Those are actually more like a 10-inch long board at the most for you to secure that. That's what I ended up using. I'll leave a link in the description to the board I ended up using. But I tried 400 grit, which again is more coarse than what General Motors said. It does not do a good job of cleaning up the surface. From the previous video, you saw the pictures where there was some corrosion. I think that's what you would expect to see with a leaking head gasket on your engine. There's some corrosion that you're going to need to knock down and level out with the block surface. So I ended up using 400, trying it out, and it smoothed everything, but you could still feel the ridges of the corrosion. And that was not what I was looking for. I was looking for a nice, smooth surface, flat surface to adhere my new gaskets to. Other forums, other videos that you may have seen, people are using 220 grit sandpaper to level out the engine block surface. And I went to 220 as well. So I put 220 on my block, running front to back, sanding evenly. Let the sandpaper do the work. You're not trying to get insane amount of pressure. The sandpaper is going to do the work, but you're also going to need to lubricate that surface. So I utilized WD-40 to turn around and lubricate the block surface, and working front to back, a nice even strokes went all the way across the deck surface and leveled it out. It didn't happen quickly. It was a process of probably, if I had to guess, I probably used a total of 8 sheets of 220 sandpaper, 4 for each side, roughly, maybe a little bit less. But we're talking probably a good solid 25 to 35 minutes per side of just working and leveling. You don't want to let it go dry. If your paper gets built up, go ahead and pull it off. If your paper tears, which happened quite a bit for me, it would snag some surface and weaken the paper and tear it. Just be prepared and be patient with this process. But you want to be able to level it out, and it's not so much what it looks like as much as what it feels like. You'd be surprised what imperfections you can feel with your hand on that surface. So run your finger across it and see if you can feel any imperfections. I also used brake cleaner to clean the surface back off. I wiped it down with some lint-free cloth to get the surface as clean as possible. But you want to feel it, and if it feels smooth, it's smooth. You may still see some staining from corrosion. Unless you're going to actually physically deck that block, it's probably going to stay, but you could feel how smooth it was, and that's what you're looking for. A flat, smooth surface, and I found 220 grit on a board using WD-40 as a lubricant. Worked out really well. Now getting ready to install head gaskets. Things to consider. I was doing this in my driveway, so I was getting rain every once in a while, that kind of stuff. You don't want to be actively doing this when it's raining, but I made sure to cover the open block with bags and that kind of stuff to protect it from direct rain or any environmental intrusion in that way. But now that we're getting ready to put on our head gaskets, we need to make sure that it is nice and clean. So we just prepped the block. We cleaned it with brake clean. Make sure everything's wiped down, no lint, that it's as clean as you can get it. Also, in the previous video, I talked about when you lifted the head, the 2 dowels. You need to make sure those dowel pins are put back onto the block, because that's going to locate your head gaskets, and it's also going to locate your head when you install it. So put those dowel pins back on, and then get ready to install your head gaskets. The head gaskets I used was Moly Grade C gaskets. The Grade C is talking about the thickness of the gasket. If you had a fresh build that was completely milled straight, you probably could get away with going to a Grade A or a Grade B gasket. But considering that we are using a longboard with sandpaper in our driveway, the Grade C Moly gasket is what we're going to want to use. I don't think you should use anything else. You're going to see multi-layer steel gaskets that are much cheaper from various people, but nobody makes an excuse for using the Moly Grade C gasket. If you look around, people will say, well, I used a MLS gasket from Felpro, and I don't want to bash Felpro here. They make good gaskets on many things, but in this particular case, people will say, I used a multi-layer steel Felpro gasket because it was cheaper than the Moly. Or somebody was like, I got this gasket because it's just as good as the Moly. They refer to it back to that gasket when they make excuses for why they didn't get that gasket. Don't do that. This is not the space where I think you should save some money. You did a lot of work to get here. Just get the Moly Grade C multi-layer steel gasket. I will leave on the screen the part numbers I used. Again, double check those part numbers. Make sure that you're getting Grade C. I bought mine off of Rock Auto. They were relatively affordable. Granted, it was 2023 in 2023. Now it's 2024 that I bought them. but they were under $80 a piece. That's not cheap, but I don't think this is where you want to skimp on the gasket. I haven't seen any research that says somebody else is making a better gasket. In fact, everybody again refers back to the Molle grade C gasket. So that's what you should use. Additionally, back to cleanliness. No sprays. All those copper sprays or other things, head gasket sprays, shellacs even, you do not use any of those. Don't use any of those. You're going to make sure your head surface is dry. You're going to make sure your block surface is dry and clean. And you're going to put the gasket on dry. That's how you're going to want to do it. No sprays. Before I forget, kind of backtracking, make sure you blow out the bolt holes for where your studs are going to go in. Clean those out. So don't continue to blow into the coolant passages, but blow into the actual fastener holes. Clean all that out. Make sure it's clean and dry. Dowel pins, install your gaskets, and then you'll be good. So the placement of the head on the engine is pretty self-explanatory. Talking about the driver's side head, two big things that you need to look for when you're installing this head is going to be the ground strap on the back of the driver's side head. You want to make sure that it's not underneath that surface when you place the head down. And then also there is a harness that runs along the front of the engine block. I want to say it goes to, I'm not sure what it goes to, but you'll see it running up in front of the driver's side gasket area. Make sure that that is down and out of the way, not pinched underneath the gasket or above the gasket. You just need to make sure that that harness in front of the driver's side head is out of the way for you to place that head on. And then on the passenger side head, if you don't have your exhaust manifold and you're by yourself, you don't have to worry about the dipstick. But if you and a friend are placing that passenger side head, you're going to need to work around that dipstick, the engine dipstick that goes in between the exhaust manifold and the head. So those are the things that you need to look out for when placing the head on the engine. Okay, now we need to move on to actually fastening the head down to the block. And this is really a question for you about whether or not you want to use head bolts or use head studs. Now, you also have some choices when it comes to head studs, too. There are two grades of ARP head studs for the Duramax, and they are drastically different in price. One, I believe, is well over $2,200, and then one is closer to $700. But there's also other options. I went with Dirty Hooker Diesel's head studs, and I will tell you why. But let's talk about head bolts first. So head bolts for the Duramax are torque to yield, as in you will start off with 2 torque settings, and then the final torques are done based on angle. When I was taking off the heads, the driver's side head specifically, as you get back to the firewall, gets really tight. Getting in an angle gauge in any way, I think, would be very difficult. I don't want to say impossible, but difficult with the cab on. It's already tight back there when you're just torquing a nut onto a stud, but you need to torque 2 torque settings. I can't remember what they are, like 30 and 60, and then you go to angles. I didn't do those, but I think that's not the best solution. And the bolts are one-time use, so you're not going to be able to reuse your bolts, and they're not exactly free. So, granted, now it's the beginning of 2024. But a set of OEM head bolts for a Duramax are around $250. Not exactly cheap, but not crazy expensive. So with that being known, head studs. So ARP head studs for the Duramax are great. I'm not going to tell you that they're not great. When I turned around and did studs on my 2G Eclipse, I used ARP head studs because I didn't want it to leak, and it never has. But those run with current 2024 prices about $675 for ARP 2000 material bolts, not bolts, but studs, washers, and nuts. I turned around and got the Dirty Hooker Diesel head studs, washers, and nuts, and those cost me $450 for that kit. Now, they make no claim that they are stronger than than ARP 2000 head studs. What they do is talk about testing, where they actually tested pounds per square inch for their Dirty Hooker diesel head studs versus ARP head studs. And ARP head studs won those comparisons. Depending on the differences in testing, and I'll put in the description where these tests were done, and actually maybe I'll put on the screen one of the graphs they used. But the ARP consistently was stronger with a tensile strength yield of 3,000 to 6,000 psi above the Dirty Hooker diesel head studs. Now, 3,000 to 6,000 psi tensile strength is a lot, you would say, but when we're talking about a difference of 220,000 psi and 223,000 psi, it's not that big of a gap when you think about it, especially when you think about that the best data I've been able to find on the tensile strength of torque to yield head bolts that were already on the engine is somewhere around 180,000. So we're talking a full 40,000 psi more strength in those fasteners than a head bolt. The Dirty Hooker diesel head studs are a drastic upgrade from OEM head bolts. Dirty Hooker diesel says they consistently run 45 psi, over 45 psi on engines using those studs. I don't envision myself running those kind of pressures, but I thought that having that safety net and the value of spending $450 on head studs versus $675 was worth it to me in that particular case. Again, this is not a recommendation not to get ARPs. I'm just saying that if you want to save a few dollars, I think the Dirty Hooker diesel head studs, they were quality. When I installed them, it was a great video. You would have loved it. But I think it's a good value and worth your time looking into, and it may be worth it. Now, I don't believe that head bolts are the way to go. Head bolts are not something I think you should put back in. Maybe if it's a fleet use vehicle and you're watching this working for a company that has 3 or 4 and you want to save some money doing some head gaskets, sure. But for your personal truck, I do not recommend doing anything like that. But again, you're going to need to pre-install a head stud or head bolt in that very back end of the driver's side head before installing, because once you put that head down, you will not be able to get a bolt in or out of that back hole. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and torque these fasteners. In the case of the Dirty Hooker diesel head studs, the torque sequence and the torque values are exactly the same as the ARP 2000s. But it's going to be a 3-step process. You're going to start by torquing it to 60 foot-pounds, then 90 foot-pounds, then 125 foot-pounds. I'll put up on the screen the diagram that came with the head studs to show you the sequence for torquing on these studs. Now, something else to think about when doing this is 125 foot-pounds is quite a bit of torque. But when you think about 125 foot-pounds, you're like, oh, well, I torque on lug nuts all the time, and they're that similar of torque, in many cases higher than that. But you got to think about the area you're working in and how much leverage you have. Also, 125 over a lot of studs, you're really going to be working that torque wrench and working yourself out. I would recommend getting a bigger torque wrench. I turned around and got a torque wrench that was capable of torquing well over 200 foot-pounds, and used that just because of the leverage you would get from a larger wrench than using one that might barely do it. I had a torque wrench that was that did up to 150 foot-pounds, and it'll totally torque down 125 foot-pounds, but it's so much shorter than one that's larger. I know it sounds what I'm saying is like I'm over here being Captain Obvious. The bigger torque wrench was easier to use, but the bigger torque wrench will be easier for you to torque on these heads and be more consistent, I believe, rather than you screaming with a smaller torque wrench. Get the bigger one and just kind of get a good solid torque. I hope that makes sense. Next would be the actual valve train install. Something to consider here is of course, with the bridges that actually go across valves, you want to make sure that you're directing those properly. I'll put in a picture of the the valve train bridges. You want to make sure the fat part of that bridge is facing away from the fuel injector hole on the head. Uh, you can install it the other way. You probably get away with doing everything until you tried to put the valve cover on and then tried to put it in the fuel injector. It's not going to fit. They need to be facing outwards, so make sure to be cognizant of that. And then additionally, the bolts that you use to torque on the rocker shaft, they can be reused. They're not torqued to yield, but depending on the age of your truck, how many times you think somebody may have done this job, or if you think in the future that you're going to upgrade the valve train on your Duramax, you may want to consider putting in ARP bolts. ARP does make rocker arm shaft bolts for the Duramax. I went ahead and purchased them, a little peace of mind to put them on, but it's something that you may consider whether or not, like, hey, do I really want to reuse these bolts, or do I want to get new ones, especially if you're going to be putting more force through the valve train. The torque spec on those shaft bolts is going to be 30 pounds, 30 foot-pounds, but you need to make sure to slowly bring them down together to not break the shaft. Just like when you took it apart, you evenly removed it. You're going to evenly pull it down, and then you're going to torque it to 30 foot-pounds. Next comes checking for valve clearance. I didn't even show in the video how to do valve clearance. I think Merchant Automotive, their website provides a diagram of how to do it, explains it very well. I briefly went over the tools that you're going to need to do valve clearance check. You're going to need to be able to spin the engine over, but granted, there's no fuel injectors in it, so it's not going to build up compression. It's actually not difficult to spin the motor over during this period, but you're going to need a 14 millimeter wrench, and then you're also going to need a flat blade screwdriver and a 12 thousandths feeler gauge to be able to do this check. But again, Merchant Automotive, I'll leave a link to that, and I'll try to put a picture of that card up on the screen for you to see. But you need to run over and do this. I think the most important tool you're going to need to bring to doing this process is patience. You can do it. It's not difficult. You want to get a good drag on that 12 thousandths feeler gauge. But another way to think about it is try to get a 13 thousandths feeler gauge in there. Once you're done and you got a good drag on your 12 thousandths feeler gauge, if you can get a 13 thousandths anywhere in there afterwards, it's too loose. If you turn around and put in your 12 thousandths, you're like, oh, it's really tight. And then you can take an 11 thousandths and still get it in there, and it's got some drag on it, then it's too tight. So that's kind of what I looked at. I went with just a 12 thousandths feeler gauge, went over the process multiple times. Once I had everything good in my mind, I did it again. Just check everything again. You don't want to have problems. You did a lot of work here. But again, Merchant Automotive has all the information you need, and just be patient with this process. Now we need to install valve covers, starting to button everything up. There are two sets of valve covers on the engine. There's going to be a lower set and an upper set. The lower set being made of metal. So you need to make sure that the head surface and the bottom of the valve cover is clean so that this metal gasket can seal. No spray, put it on dry. And then you'll torque on that lower valve cover to 89 inch-pounds. Moving on to the upper. The upper is going to be a rubber gasket. That rubber gasket is going to go into a groove into the upper valve cover. And when you torque that one down, it's going to actually be done in two steps. So you're going to torque it initially to 71 inch-pounds. And then once you're done, come back and torque it again. The gasket will settle a little bit. You'll be able to get a little bit more of a turn on all of the bolts that's holding on that gasket. So you need to do it twice. 71 inch-pounds, 2 times. I thought it would be good to upgrade to ARP valve cover bolts. You'll see these valve cover bolts. There is the 12-point valve cover bolts and 6 points. I got the 12s because I thought they would look nice, and they do. You'll see them in the video that I have for fuel injectors. You'll see them. But something to think about when you get the 12-point ARP bolts, if you decide to, is It's going to be an 8mm 12 point, and it needs to be 1/4 inch drive. You would think that is something that is very common that you're going to have in your toolbox. I have a lot of tools. I did not have an 8mm 12 point 1/4 inch drive socket. In fact, the town I'm in, including Columbia, South Carolina, does not have that. They don't have, there isn't a store that sells tools that has an 8mm 12 point 1/4 inch drive. I'm originally from Tampa. You can probably see my Buccaneer flag in the background. The Bucks are playing on Monday. Hopefully they can win. Um, but I had family members in Florida because they were coming up because it was around the holidays. Look real quick to see if they could find an 8mm 12 point 1/4 inch drive. If you decide to go with 12 point bolts for your valve covers, just know you're probably going to have to go on Amazon and order a specific socket, because I certainly did. So I'll leave a link in the description for that in case that's you. But you very well could just go with the 6 point bolts. They'd probably be fine. I just thought I'd be fancy and special. Now we can move on getting our fuel injectors ready to install. Key thing on these, only one copper washer. Make sure you remove the old copper washer and installed a new copper sealing washer on the bottom of your injectors. Additionally, put new O-rings, lubricate new O-rings on your injectors. The difficulty that I had removing one particular injector was all about corrosion getting past the upper seal. And if you don't have a good seal with your copper at the bottom of the injector, you're going to be leaking compression. That's power going away. On top of that, it's going to cause other leaks. So very important, change the copper. You can press on the copper by hand, just pushing it down. But I found using a deep well socket, I think it was 10mm, I was able to just press it down using that to evenly press it onto the fuel injector, but definitely new injector seals. Okay, so now we're all caught up with all the footage that was lost on this head gasket install. So now I want to show you the footage that I actually still have of the install. But before getting to that, if you like this kind of content, granted, this isn't the step-by-step video that I hoped it would be installing head gaskets on LBZ, but I still hope that you're able to gain some information from this. And if you have any questions about anything I've gone over or something you think I have missed in this video, please leave me a comment. I want to have a conversation. Let's talk about cars. Let's talk about trucks. I enjoy speaking with you guys or talking to you guys through comments about anything I'm doing here on Grumpy Vet Garage. But if you enjoy this kind of content, please consider subscribing to my channel. It really helps me out. Like this video, share this video. We also have a Grumpy Vet Garage merch store. This is a Grumpy Vet Garage zip-up hoodie. We also have pullover hoodies and t-shirts in the store. Link to that store is in the description below. By all means, go get yourself something and help out the channel. But let me go ahead and show you the video that we still have for the head gasket install. Now we need to go ahead and put on fuel injectors. So the thing you have to make sure to remember is you have to put the pad right there. It needs to be put back in its hole on the valve cover. I put anti-seize just because I saw a lot of corrosion when I removed it. So I'm trying to protect it, but also, I mean, it's a steel pad onto an aluminum base. So inherently it's going to be susceptible to corrosion. But also you need to look down into, let me see if I can get it down in there, into the hole. Make sure it's nice and clean. I really can't get a good view in there. You want to make sure it's nice and clean and ready to accept the fuel injector. And then when you put the seal on the injector, make sure it's lubed up properly with oil so it should slide right in. Okay, so got the injector here. I got a new O-ring on it and it's all lubed up with oil. And then went ahead and pressed on the new copper. I checked the hole to make sure that it's good. Now I'm going to try to place it in. So with it placed in the hole, again, you lubed it up to try to help with the install. You want to just kind of rock it a little bit to lube up that area so that it'll pop down. And hopefully I can get it to pop down pretty easily. And there it goes. And she's home. And you can see, let me shake the camera, and you can see that it's in contact with the pad. Pull down bolts are torqued down. They're torqued down to 22 foot-pounds. I put some anti-seize on those as well. There was a lot of corrosion on those bolts when I removed them, so I didn't want them to be a difficult to get back out again in case maybe I upgrade injectors or something like that. So make sure to take care of yourself for future maintenance and not just slap a rusty bolt back in. But now is when you would put in your Y bridge. I'm going to link in the description the video I did for installing this SDP Y bridge. It's very similar to even the factory Y bridge, but I already have it installed. It's not that bad once you kind of get used to what you need to do. But now we need to go ahead and move on to putting fuel injector lines back on. So the rails have been exposed to the elements the entire time. So what you need to do before you turn around and try to put in injector lines, and you also need to clean the injector lines, is I'm going to clean it with some brake cleaner. But I'm going to go ahead and remove it because I don't want to spray brake cleaner all over the truck. But unbolt it, clean it really good, thoroughly, so it looks clean to you. And then do the same thing with the injectors, the injector lines that you labeled, and then put them down at least finger tight. So I cleaned up the rails and all the fittings. You want to get any kind of trash out, and again, use the brake clean. But went ahead and put on the lines to the injectors going to the rail. There's still other lines that need to go back on, but all fuel lines going to any of the fittings are torqued to 30 foot-pounds. Now, you can use a flare nut wrench, but it's going to be difficult to torque and really impossible to torque accurately, which, in my opinion, actually might not be that big of a deal. But if you want to put a torque wrench on the lines, you're going to need to get something like this, which is a flared nut crow's foot set. So I'll leave a link in the description for where you can get something like this. But again, in my opinion, while I do like these, and these are very convenient, I like these over a flared nut wrench, but you really just need to kind of smoke them down. They just need to be tight so they don't leak. So as tight as they need to be to get no fuel leakage. But I'm going to start putting together the lines coming, the coolant line from the turbo, other fuel lines. All of this was removed in my part 1 video. So if you want to see where everything goes, putting stuff back together, go ahead and refer to my part 1 video. I don't want to insult anybody's intelligence and do it all over again in the reverse order. You saw me take it off. It goes back on the same way. Okay, everything's back together. I've actually been driving the truck for well over a month with the computer issue. It kind of set me back getting this final bit of the video together. But everything's fine. I'm not having any coolant pressure issues. I'm not having any smoke issues, any loss of any fluids. Everything is good to go. It's actually better than it really has ever been since I've had this truck. But now I want to go ahead and crank it up for you so you can hear it run. So definitely the filming of this video didn't go the way that I wanted it to. The install of the head gaskets in the new Fleece Performance heads and head studs from Dirty Hooker Diesel, those went great. I was a little concerned about the idea that I was going to be doing this job in my driveway. I have a garage, but it's not big enough to house this truck for this job. So I'm glad to say that this is something definitely I think that you could do in your driveway if you needed to. Garage would be better, but you could definitely do it. So don't be discouraged if you need to do this job and you have a truck like this. You can take care of it. You can do this job. Something else to remember though is once you get it running, you need to be cognizant of checking for leaks. Also, listening to what you smell. If you smell coolant, maybe you have a coolant leak. Don't freak out. It might just be a hose because you took a lot of stuff apart. But also diesel smells. That was the one thing that I found with this after the install. I went for a long drive, and when I came back out of the truck, I had a distinct smell of diesel. Very, very small leak on the driver's side on one of the lines. That crow's foot came in very handy to be able to get down in there to actually torque on that line without having to pull too much stuff out of the way. But once you get done, just make sure that you're checking things over even days after you started driving the truck, just to make sure that you're not having another issue that you need to take care of. But again, if you have any questions or want to have a conversation with me about this or anything else we're doing in Grumpy Pet Garage, please leave a comment. I'll get back to you. But again, thanks for coming and seeing me in my garage. And until next time, have a good one.